between July and now October, the sort of context has shifted quite a bit. And you see that context shifting even today, you know, with the budget thing yesterday, the increase, the reduction in universal credit, or, you know, not maintaining the uplift and so on. All of those are part of the context which I'll be looking at. So hopefully this screen share did share a few minutes ago, so hopefully it will still share. So I'm going to try and share it, yes. So I'll share this one. And if so, I can't now see you, so if one of you can say that you can speak, that you can hear it, that would be helpful.
It's there, Naomi. It's showing on my screen.
It's on your screen. Okay, great. I'm going to assume that people can see it there. So this, Mark said a little bit about me. He's right. I have just finished the third edition of The Economist book called Designing Organizations, and the subtitle is Why It Matters and Ways to Do It Well. And I had a little bit of a discussion with the publisher because he wanted to call it How to Do It Well. And I said it's not a how-to book, and there's no prescription for organization design. There are multiple methods, and I think that's also important to start to think about. There isn't one right way, so I'm always a little bit skeptical of a prescriptive method, because part of being in this complex context is to be able to flex what you're doing. I won't go into any detail on this. You can see the organizations I've worked in. Up until a year ago, I was working with the civil service in various roles, but all to do with organization design. And now I'm working independently. And if you want to contact me, my contact details are there. So in the course of the several decades I've been in organization design, the thinking about what it is has shifted. And I did write a blog the week before last called Time Changes Understanding, about how, and it was really a reflection on what's different about the third edition book. What has changed? Well, you can see just in this sort of fairly straightforward table, former assumptions and current assumptions. And
no, sorry to interrupt. Naomi. The slides haven't advanced.
They haven't advanced. Okay, have you got them?
I don't think I've got a hard copy. I haven't got a soft copy at this end.
Okay, let me stop sharing, and I'll come out, and I'll try again.
Okay.
I have noticed that actually they don't advance sometimes on this. I'll have to speak them if they don't advance. I'll try once more. I'll open the share tray, desktop window. Can you, if I keep them in this mode, do they advance?
You've gone forward. You're on slide 3 on the screen. I can see now. And now 4.
Yeah, that's. Did it advance? Did it advance to 4?
Yeah.
But I think if I can just interrupt, I think what needs to happen is you need to go on slideshow. So you see right down at the bottom where the sliding scale is. If you go to the button on the left, that's it. Then you'll end up. If you press that, you should end up with the slideshow.
Yes, I've got the slideshow, but I'll try it again. So now you should see 2 columns. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. It still may not advance, but we'll give it a go. So here you've got this former and current. And what I find interesting about the current assumptions is crisis-ridden and unpredictable, interdependent systems and processes, emergent and what have you. But if you look down the list here, it is still a kind of so what? I would be surprised if people didn't already know several of these things. And so the so whatness hasn't translated into what to do differently. If we know it's crisis-ridden and unpredictable, which I think all do, why are we still doing organization design work in a kind of programmatic, as if it were still relatively predictable way? And if we know organization design is about interdependent systems and processes, why is it that we are doing, say, service design as a service without paying real attention to what is going on in the rest of the system. And I was actually in a service design meeting yesterday where I did ask that question of how do you get the interdependencies. So the current assumptions are not necessarily translating into the way of doing organization design work differently, or even the way of thinking about organizations differently. And I think that that's something that I've started to kind of wonder about. Okay, I'm going to try and advance the slide. Tell me if it goes to the next slide. Can you see something that says context 1?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, right. I'm going to come out and then go advance it manually. What can you see now?
Yeah, 3 columns, blue heading, context
3
1.
headings, okay. Right, I'll do it like this. So can you see 3 blue columns?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I find so fascinating about these 20 global crises that we're in, going back to the point that I just made that it's crisis, that the context is crisis ridden and unpredictable. If you look down these 3 lists, just glance down them, the list was generated in 2002, and the book title is called 20 Global Problems, 20 Years to Solve Them. And we're nowhere near solving most of them. Some of them have begun to be addressed, but if you start to look at them, you kind of get overwhelmed with, and I'm sorry, Mark's had such a lovely day so far, but he may now think, oh my God, how are we going to cope with all this lot? That it really does become overwhelming of how can we start to think about all of these crises which are interlocking in the context of our day-to-day work. And the kind of bigger design question, I think, that comes up for me is, do we have a responsibility to? Is it a kind of moral imperative in our organizations that we are all working to design organizations which at least acknowledge these crises and then do whatever we can in our context to think about them? And so you see things like water deficits, and I'm very intrigued that my current water provider, Affinity Water, is now doing a lot to draw attention to how to use water more efficiently, more economically, what bits and bobs to put in on your taps or in your cistern to save water, etc. And I think that in the organizations I've worked with to date, at some level there is an acknowledgement that we're in this very difficult context, but not, again, a translation of that into real different thinking about the organization and our organizational and individual responsibilities, if we accept them or not. And I think it's worth having that discussion as well. And I won't go into all of these, but I did run an exercise with them last week when people started to add to the list, which was kind of even more alarming in a way. But if you are feeling alarmed, I do recommend a lovely newspaper, weekly, or I think it's daily actually, called Positive News, which shows you exactly how these are getting addressed in some aspects. And that I get a daily newsletter, Positive News, and it's not all sort of glad handing. It's a very, very useful newsletter to get. And there's another lovely book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, which is more sort of philosophical about how you can maintain optimism and activism in this sort of context. And this context is affecting organization design all the time, and I'm sure you've seen it in the NHS on things like supply issues, on things like resource use, on things like well, vaccine provision and so forth, and how we can at our individual levels within our own teams start thinking about it becomes material in a design sense. The second thing about the context is the more immediate pandemic context. And it's very fascinating for me to see how that shifted over the last several months. I was on the London Underground today, and it was really, really packed, and very few people were wearing masks. Less than probably about 15%, even though the notices say please wear a mask. So there are shifts into something else from the immediacy of the pandemic. And if you think about last year, what I loved was the Oxford Languages produce a word of the year, a single word of the year every year. And for 2020, they couldn't produce one word. So they produced a 40-page document with all the words in these categories of political and economic volatility, social activism, the environment, new technologies, and the remote working and living, as well as COVID. And it's a fascinating quick skim through all the new words that we've all started to use without probably really noticing much. And then the organisation design approach in this, and this is where I've begun to think, and this is one of the differences in the third edition, is that there aren't actually solutions. And for those of you familiar with the concept of wicked problems, a lot of these points come from this sort of thinking around wicked problems, which is a well-researched field. But solutions only help us understand the problem better. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And it's quite difficult to solve some of these problems that we're meeting every day. And with the COP26 coming up next week, that there won't be solutions. There'll be understanding perspectives better, I hope, and some steps towards doing something that will give us greater understanding. So one of the kind of discussions I've often had in my working life is, what is the right answer? And I did, in fact, have that very question. I presented to an executive team some options for their new redesign, like A option, B option. And they said, well, we don't want options. What is the right answer? And I said, well, there isn't a right answer. There are various options, and we wouldn't know till we implemented either one or other which one was going to work out, because the context is shifting all the time. And although that might not help you feel sort of positive in a sense, it is actually positive, because it's managing a sort of mindset around, we can handle the emergent stuff as we are currently doing. Think how many technologies that you can read about now which are in fact beginning to help with some of these global problems. This collaborative strategies, I think, is a slightly under threat, but I'm interested in your views on that, because I think there's a tendency in the sort of geopolitical sense to start relying on more autocratic leaders, and I wonder if that will spill into organization designs, but that's a question mark. The holistic thinking, and I keep coming back to that, it's very difficult to put boundaries around what is your holistic thinking. Is it the entire universe, or is it you in your job and role and team? And in organization design terms, to design sensibly, you need, in my experience, to have discussions around what are the boundaries of the system we're looking at. Not in a bounded sense like a wall, but in a sort of permeable sense that could potentially shift. And an example of that is the one that's come up. Someone was talking to me last week about heavy goods vehicle drivers. And they were delivering into a supermarket. So this is the vehicle drivers. And the people in the supermarket wouldn't let the drivers use the toilet facilities or the canteen, because the drivers were not part of that supermarket chain's organization. Now, if you're thinking that you're in a whole system of a supplier chain to purchaser, are the lorry drivers inside or outside your holistic thinking? And what is going to be part of a win-win collaborative approach to that question? So I think that demands some thinking about. One that I started to do a couple of years ago, several years ago, is a lot of things at the same time. So you're, in other parlance, lighting small fires and looking for lots and lots of entry points. And that is really, really important, and sort of speaks somewhat against a programmatic approach. And then point 6 is that the I mentioned it already, there are not right or wrong solutions quite often, they're better or worse. So I'm a bit reluctant to say that transformation fails, for example, or the change fails as a failure. It's doing something differently than you expected it or wanted it to do. And there is an excellent organization called Fail Forward with a mass of resources on how to work with failures and view them positively and learn from them. Fail Forward, which is all one word, .org, which is definitely worth looking at. And then finally, where I think that we could start to think more closely, and again, it's a little bit of a wish list that looks not very deep at one level, but the systems I've mentioned, I'm quite a fan of encouraging rebels. And there are two organizations that I often look at called, I'm sure you know one of them at least, Corporate Rebels and Rebels at Work. Because that, the ability to speak up is really courageous, and we see it in that Facebook whistleblower. And often rebels do have a point. So someone who seems jarring and kind of uncomfortable to be with, it's worth trying to approach them in a win-win situation. I'm finding out actually what is your point of view? Why are you taking a different point of view? And understanding that. And I've in my work have found that very helpful. Recognizing the complexity I've talked about. The one about understanding the cultures I find interesting, because again, in my work, people have wanted to say, we want to change the culture. And over the years, and it's brought up in the book again, there isn't one culture. There are multiple cultures in an organization. Oh, hang on, I don't know if I'm still advancing the slides, but hopefully this will be okay for you. Are you still there?
Yes, Naomi.
Good.
It was all making sense without the slides moving forward from my perspective.
Right. So understanding the cultures, organizations are multiple cultures. And I think that's really important to recognize that there isn't one culture in an organization. So you can't say we want a collaborative culture or a team culture. You can only say, let's look at what cultures manifest in the organization. And that puts a very different slant on the question, can you design the culture, which is one that I frequently get asked. And then challenge your own assumptions and everyone else's assumptions, which can again be uncomfortable. But it's very difficult to do that because you don't necessarily know what you're thinking is an assumption. Then the thing that I think is the most difficult for established organizations is to stop swirling around and to actually do something. The incessant demand for more information before you make a decision is particularly prevalent. It certainly was in the government departments that I worked in. We can't make a decision until we've got more information. Oh, thank you for the more information. We still can't make a decision. We need more information. And that leads nowhere. And then what I think we did very well at points during the pandemic, early points and the mid points, confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, which is called the Stockdale paradox, which is James Stockdale was a general who was imprisoned in a Vietnamese war camp and survived. He was one of a very few survivors because of that attitude that he took. And it's worth reading the sort of his approach to confronting the brutal facts of your current reality. And that's as far as I wanted to go. I think that might be slightly over 15 minutes, but I hope that's okay, Mark.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Naomi. There's tons of stuff in there for us to get our teeth into. So I think that's perfect as an introductory kind of set of remarks that we can pivot around. And if people now have comments or questions and want to put them in the chat box, I'll try and pick them up as we run along. Just to pick up a couple of those themes, I think the rebel notion is an important one. I do, this is a very personal observation, I think the corporate rebels these days are slightly more corporate than rebellious. I think that's where they've ended up. I've worked with them in the past. I think they're delightful, but there's just something about that, how that rebellion can sometimes become incorporated. It's the old Deleuzian line of flight. It gets assimilated very quickly. I do think when we're talking about rebels, it's about making sure we're rebels with a cause and rebels connected. Because a rebel on their own is just a maverick, and they can be treated as, oh, that's just Mark. He's, he's Mark. That's how we sometimes deal with people in organisations. Or, oh, that's Mark. He's a problem. Somehow we've got to manage him out the organisation. So I think rebellion is powerful. Organisations desperately need it, but my view is very much that you need to do it collaboratively. Otherwise, it's very easy to be isolated. And I just wanted to say in passing, I'm just starting some work with John Higgins that looks at work he's previously done on speaking up in corporate settings, the work he's subsequently done around listening up. But actually what we're minded to look at in slightly more detail is quite considerable failure on the part of leadership in many instances to actually hear what is being said. So many leaders are properly entrained now to tilt their head and smile slightly and say, oh yes, I'm listening. I've had a town hall meeting and I'm taking all your comments on board. But actually they're not hearing the rebellion that's taking place within the organisation. So I do think there's something in there about that. I also I saw this morning that the Sloan Review had dropped its paywall. So all their articles are free. One of the top 10 articles was, it's time now for executives to change their culture. And I thought, do I want to waste my time reading this piece of corporate boilerplate? Because it'll be nonsense. And there's a danger there for me. Whenever somebody says, let's change the culture, I go back to Hugh Wilmot's article, who made a fantastic comparison between Orwell's 1984 and corporate leaders saying, let's change the culture. Because the only person that really wants to change a culture in that way is a totalitarian. Or you can tell I'm on holiday, so I'm not sure they can sack me for saying these things, because I'm not actually at work. Naomi, to come back, because there's so much in there, it's fantastic. Spinning off the back of that kind of lots of professional service companies, so-called thought leaders, pushing us to a position which says, our workplace, the workplace of the future and the new normal. From your perspective, thinking very differently about all design, what sort of things would you say about how we might think about our present and how we wish things were? So instead of defaulting to the present for the future workplace and the new normal, where would your thinking put us instead in terms of getting into thinking about that kind of stuff?
Are you asking me or the audience or all of us?
Well, I'll ask you to start with, but if anybody wants to pile in, let's just go for it.
I think that's a good question, because one of the aspects of the organisations that I've worked in recent years, predominantly government or local authority, are well established. And I think a huge challenge is to work with that concept of path dependency. If you're already on a path, how do you get off it or do something very different? And so if you take a retailer, say Marks and Spencer is never going to be Amazon. But Amazon itself, because it was set up as Amazon, may well have an upstart challenge it before very long, with cryptocurrencies or these non-fungible token things and all the rest of it. The challenge for well-established systems is that they have so much investment in the actual systems, the IT systems, the performance management systems, the governance systems, and what have you. But to challenge them takes a really determined effort, which is why one of the approaches is to light all the small fires and try out lots of different things and see if they work. And In fact, there are several examples I've come across in the NHS where there have been some really great examples of very small but really very telling possibilities even within the system, which is why I think why I make the point about boundaries. When you can change a system, but it means starting with bounding your own bit of the system in a way that makes you have the ability to then scale it up without disrupting what you've already set in motion. I think new organizations where they have a playing field which is more experimental have less of an issue, and so in changing, because they're just smaller often and they haven't got that legacy of hundreds and hundreds of years. But there are also some pretty good examples of organizations which do have a very long history that have managed to change. And one that is very often quoted is a Chinese white goods company, Haier, H-A-I-E-R, which has changed massively from a traditional, hierarchy into what he's now calling modular ecosystems. But the interesting thing about that is that it's had the same CEO since 1985. So a lot of stability at the top driving the change. So I think looking at where the path dependency could kind of be interrupted without disrupting everything in one go, and then trying to sort of open the crack a bit more is quite a useful approach.
Yeah, thank you. I think that stuff about being on the path and finding a struggle to step off is a bit like being on a children's roundabout. You've got a vested interest on staying on, and if you step off, you might fall on your face. So it is that thing about I can't see how I'd step off to do things differently, and so we end up going down the same track. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone, really. And I'm always reminded of the quote from Macbeth about I'm so steeped in blood, I can't now go. It's too far for me to go back, so I'm going to press on. So I think that's interesting. The other thing I've spotted just recently is quite a lot of people talking about the kind of safe to fail experiments, letting little things take off, and we've tried to support some of that in London. And what it does is to set up something of a tension, even in a systemic context where people start to say, well, yeah, we're very excited about the experiments, but what if they don't quite resonate with our corporate intention as an ICS or as a bounded system? So I think there's all sorts of ways in which we need to chip away at some of those issues, just to get people to think differently about them in many ways. Tracy from Lewisham Greenwich Trust has said that quality improvement programs are a good example as well in terms of getting people to perhaps to look at things differently. Am I representing you reasonably well there, Tracy? In fact, Richard is inviting you in to perhaps expand on that. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, so we've Lewisham and Greenwich Trust, we've actually embraced the QI program. We actually have a head of QI for the trust, and this is a trust-wide initiative for all banded staff to look at small things in their areas that could have a significant kind of outcome. And so the whole process is like a structured methodology of kind of trial and error, like try this one, it doesn't work, try another one. And you do it on a pilot scheme basis. And then once you come to, if there is a successful outcome, you can then roll it out as a trust-wide initiative. But it just means that it's empowering a lot of shop floor staff who can see the day-to-day issues and giving them the power to say, well, let's come up with ideas for change. So I found it to be very beneficial.
I think that's fantastic summary. I think trust can approach that work in two ways. I can think of trusts that do it really well because they have their teams kind of getting alongside people and supporting people to come up with those fresh ideas and not to take a rejection as something that's a major setback. So I think that there is something very, very powerful in that. But it's also about then saying to people, even if it's not then called QI, there are other ways in which you can kind of engage with this kind of work, which I think is really, really interesting and very exciting, because I think it does then allow people to tackle those kind of bits of work. if I nudge us on a little, I'll pick up on Lisa's comment, which is she's talking about the NHS people plan as an org design re-engineering piece, asking everyone to work differently in a system that's in flux. Lisa, did you want to say a little? Well, yeah, I'm kind of inviting you in. Could you just say a little more about what your thoughts were in that regard?
Yeah, I don't think I'd ever really thought of the people plan as an org design piece massively before, but actually it is asking everybody to work quite differently, both within the system and beyond the system with partners. And I guess it's just interesting that we've got that, and obviously we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic at the time they started to write that, but certainly working at system level where we're closing organisations down and standing other organisations up, and there's a huge amount of kind of rolling security to actually try to do that piece of work and land it positively so that people don't feel the incongruence between what is said and what is done. I think is quite interesting. You know, as an OD practitioner working at system level, people are saying the people plan says this, and yet what I'm receiving is this. So that kind of re-engineering of our cultures through the people plan, I'm not sure is as effective as it could have been at a different time.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Naomi, did you want to make any commentary on that?
I think that, yeah, I think that that's really a very interesting approach. That because a people plan is an organisation design piece of work, and I've seen it work really well if it's done in the context of other changes. It's a bit like the service design example I mentioned earlier. If you want to ask people to work differently, which often they really do want to, and they're very keen to, there are other forces hampering them, like the target setting or the governance structures, or Mark already mentioned the sort of leadership training around that. That there have to be systems that are supporting the people plan intention. And that can become more complex because, well, when I've seen that happen, you get questions like the finance department won't let you do this because of the whatever. You know, there's other vested interests, not in necessarily what the people plan is trying to achieve in its thinking, but in its actual day-to-day implementation. We can't ask people to work differently from an IT perspective because the fields in our data set don't allow us to put new skills in, or whatever it is. You know, they can be very tiny little things which interfere. But if those can be thought through carefully or addressed as they arise, sort of one by one, then it can be an incredibly powerful force for change, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about some of the work we've done recently in London has taken us into a place where people are trying to work systemically, and they're trying to get with the flux and recognize that things are changing and almost coming to terms with, and I dread to say the word because I know it'll terrify the horses, but we talk about emergence. I think it's an important word, but I know it unsettles people in many ways. It's a difficult word to then use. And we talk about system working in that sense, and people finding new ways of doing the work that they're asked to do, which is very exciting. But we're still carrying forward the kind of stuff we've done in the past. So I was at part of a conversation the other week where people were very, very strongly focused on, even though they were working as a collective, they just kept talking about patient pathways, which meant, you know, you could start at point A and run to point Z and everything would be done. Whereas they also said at the same time, I can't really work out what system I'm in. I can't see what I'm connected to. So that kind of patient pathway as a frame actually inhibits people from working in a systemic way and in a creative way. I'm just picking up on sports. Another big
Mark, you've frozen. I don't know if you realise we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me? And we'll see if Mark comes back. This is Naomi speaking. Can anyone raise their hand if they can hear me speak? Okay, great. So I think Mark, are you back again?
I'm not sure you'll hear. Oh, okay, that's good. I'm back.
You vanished. Good.
I did. It threw me out I was so boring. It threw me out my own meeting. Do carry on. I just
asking because I was going to go on to a different question from the list, but you go ahead, Mark.
Okay. No, I was just going to pick up perhaps on the next step in terms of the challenges we face. And there were several people raised the question about what kind of role, or not even a role, but what presence might org design have as a body of ideas and practice in supporting us to think about making the work we do and the way in which we try to structure it more supportive in terms of inclusion and to address health inequalities. So I guess the question is it possible to do structural work to try and tackle those things, or do we just have to go back to kind of all design first principles about relationships and connections between people and agencies? So if we see inclusion as the big challenge, does org design have anything to say to us about how we might tackle that?
That's an incredibly good question, because I think that behaviour is shaped by systems, and systems are shaped by behaviours and cultures. So it's an interdependency. But you can certainly change behaviours by changing the systems. I mean, you can see that in the sort of, if you set a target, which is the system's target, like wait time should be X, then you see perverse behaviours to get around that target. And so structural systems do shape behaviours and cultures. But your question about how organisation design can work like that, there are loads and loads of people in organisations who do types of organisation design work, but not necessarily with that label. So yesterday I said I was in a meeting with service designers. There are enterprise designers. There are customer experience designers. You mentioned the patient pathways, which someone must be designing. And if you look around the organisation and try to think who in our organisation is doing types of stuff that might be roughly construed as organisation design, whether or not they call it that, and you see it in the legal profession, in the legal departments where they're trying to shape policies and procedures. That is regulations or compliance. That is all design of systems. And what we often fail to do is get all of those people simultaneously looking at something together from their different design perspectives, essentially. Because they're all looking at it through slightly different lenses, and they're all pretty much interested in the user of whatever it is they're designing. Although who is the user is itself a problematic question quite often. But I've been struck over recent years of the variety of people involved in design work and how to help that community of very loose designers much more integrate not their methodology necessarily, but their ability to think that other people are thinking similarly to them, and there could be benefits of being much more collaborative. In fact, in the civil service, we did an experiment in the Cabinet Office of drawing together about 40 different practitioners from different kind of disciplines, around roughly design, and it was a very fascinating loose network for several months.
Okay, yeah. I just wondered, I think that constellation of everybody who has an interest and a commitment trying to shape things differently is absolutely vital. I mean, one of the things we've done in London is we've traditionally run an OD network. So it's people with OD in their job title. And we we thought to ourselves probably 18 months ago, that's crazy. Because there are lots of people doing work that's seeking to transform the way in which things are delivered, but they just don't have OD in the title. They've got lots of different names, and they all need to be in the space to have an exchange. And just to follow that on, I wonder what your thought is about. I don't want to sound like a glib corporate drone, but how do you get the authentic voice of the user into that mix as well? Because I mean, the NHS has a strong reputation around patient involvement, but I'm not sure that's experienced by patients out at large. And you know, one of the systems challenges for the NHS is it has a significant democratic deficit in contrast to local authorities. So I wonder how org design can support the user voice to have a parity of esteem in a conversation amongst experts.
Well, I like your parity of esteem amongst experts, because it depends what you're calling expert. A patient is expert essentially at being a patient potentially. Expertise comes in many forms, and I think it's respect for different forms of expertise, which points to some level to inclusion, is a question. The getting the authentic voice of the patient, or I'm doing some work in the education sector at the moment, the parents and the children in the education sector, is proving a very interesting question, which I guess is going to be similar to the patients thing, because it comes back to your point, Mark, earlier about you can ask them to speak, and people do speak authentically, and nothing then happens. They're not heard or listened to. So there's a gap between an intention, the actual voice coming through, which you can get in various ways, the consultations, or nominate a patient to come and talk with us, or focus groups, or collaborative citizen assembly type things in your own context. And the citizens' assemblies, I think, is a very interesting model that could be brought into organizations. But then the gap is, then what do you do with that if you don't like what you're hearing, or it's too difficult to address? I think the difficulty is in addressing the whatness. So what are we going to do with this now we've heard it?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. And that, as you say, that is that point about we can be seen to be listening, but actually hearing what is being said, and then having a dialogue around that. So it's fine to say the tolerances of what we're trying to deliver don't allow us to do X as you've described it, but it's just making sure we don't use the population at large as some sort of stage army that we bring on, have a conversation with, and then shuffle off and say thanks very much for your feedback, and we'll call you again in a year. And I've suddenly found a soapbox to stand on, and I'll just step off before I trip off it and bang my head. Iana has talked about org design and inclusion, and particularly about hierarchies and the way in which we tend to think hierarchically in organizational settings. Even when people tend to do what they think is org design, they tend to start with, we'll put the boss at the top, and then they've got two people reporting to them, and the span of control goes across that way. And I think that's really a significant thing. One of the points I often make in conversations I hold is if you say to people, what does your team look like in terms of a shape, the shape they'll show you is a pyramid. It's always a pyramid by and large. They'll say, that's what it's like. It looks like that. And I keep suggesting that instead of, by doing that, we perpetuate the notion that hierarchy is some way a natural state, which I'm not sure it actually is. And I've suggested to people that instead of looking at the side of the pyramid, which will just reinforce that notion, you just flatten that pyramid down so you're looking down on top of it. And it goes from being a kind of stacked structure like a tree to something slightly more networked and rhizomatic. So I think there is something about how we manage org design to ensure we're not reproducing past practices which might take us off down the wrong path. So I think that's a fascinating intervention, talking about hierarchy and how that works. Just to return to the issue of inclusion, there was a fascinating question, and I'm feeling it tangibly today, which is, when it comes to hybrid working, how can we manage the inequality that allows Mark Cole to sit running this meeting in a very comfortable holiday let, and when the meeting is finished, I'll pop off to the beach, and that'll be nice. Whereas all the radiographers I've spoken to recently in a big project we're doing, they'll be at the front line doing practical work, and the luxury of hybrid working, or the luxury of not being present in that way, is denied to them. So, Naomi, do you have any thoughts about whether that's balanceable or reconcilable, or is it just something we have to experiment with, I guess?
Right, so there's another lovely problem, intractable opportunity. I do think there are ways of thinking about it more broadly. So there are some types of roles where you can actually work remotely, and there are some that you can't, and that's a sort of
We've lost you, Naomi. Okay, she'll probably have to die. Oh, she's back.
Do I want an office job or do I want a sitting job or a out there job working with, you know, in the front line? But that aside, imagine that you have home working or remote working as one of a menu of possibilities of that people felt were of equal value to them in their role. So if you are a radiographer and you're in every day, could you have as a menu of opportunity, one day a week you can have an additional day's leave or something like that, so that, or we'll extend your hours so that you're working the same number of hours but on a different work schedule. So I think that we tend to think hybrid working is for some people and not for others, without thinking about it in a context of a menu of possible ways of doing the work. If you start to think how many ways can various pieces of work be done, then you start getting a different possibility. And you can see it at the kind of very stark level in warehouses, where warehouse is the Amazon ones have robotic pickers. Well, I'm not suggesting that for radiographers, but it is you can think of other ways of potentially either adjusting work schedules, adjusting skills interplays, or thinking of, mobile libraries is an interesting one, because libraries used to be in a site, then there were mobile libraries. There are different ways of doing things that I'm interested in, the way community hubs are coming up, which offers more flexibility to workers. So if you think of hybrid working as something that is a possibility, how many roles could we start to incorporate that type of flexible work production into? You have a different view of it.
That's a lovely answer, and Joe has helpfully said people make choices about the work they do, and they've made those choices potentially early in their career. I recall a friend of mine who's now a consultant ophthalmologist, and I said to him, why did you choose ophthalmology? And he said, it's the only surgery I could do sitting down. So, there are all sorts of motivations in which people do that kind of stuff. And Joe's added that she knows of a digital solution to enable radiographers to work one day from home per week. So what I'm taking from that answer, no, it was a really powerful thing for me, which is it just needs that additional creativity to actually get to the roots of the issue, rather than just skating across the top and saying this isn't working, but actually going deep down and saying, how can we make this kind of stuff work for everybody? I'm just checking. Richard's asked whether we know of any. He's pointed out there was a BBC stat recently said 46% of UK jobs could be done from home. And did anyone out there in the audience know of any stats specifically for the NHS? I certainly don't. and the silence, Richard suggests. the hive mind can't help you with that either, but I suspect there's probably a chunky piece of work to be done there about how we might think creatively about all the different roles and how much needs to be done face to face. Oh no, Naomi's, oh no, she's back. Is she back or back in? I'm conscious it's 3 minutes to 3. I'm hoping Naomi will rejoin in just a moment, but that's our time to get there. So I suspect, well, certainly from my perspective, that has gone by extraordinarily quickly, and I really hope that people have found something useful in there. I think it's been an interesting conversation and a great exchange. So thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you in particular for Naomi for making time to talk to us again today and to share with us your thoughts and your fresh thinking and some real challenges there for me to take away and think about. So that's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks to everybody. And hopefully Mark can send the slide deck. And if you do want to contact me, my details are in the slide deck, but I also am contactable on LinkedIn and Twitter and what have you. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks
everyone for being a participant.
Yeah, it was a really good talk. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark and Naomi. Bye.
Bye.